Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
This morning we have Colin Stoodley with us, and Colin is the Director of Church Planning Services of Queensland Baptist, as well as being a consultant to the Salvation Army in various states. Colin, it's fantastic to have you with us here today. You've got a wealth of information and insights, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of those things.
Very kind of you to have me. Thank you.
A pleasure. Colin, let's start off by talking about your own journey in church planting. Would you mind unpacking that for us a little bit?
Yeah. My journey began when I began my ministry with my wife. We were sent by the Salvation Army that I was an officer with at the time. We were sent to Canberra and in specifics to the Tuggeranong Valley to plant a new work there. And we planted what was called then the Waniasa Corps. We were there 6 years. I reflect back on that with some amusement because everything we know about best practice regarding church planting is what we didn't do. And, learned a few lessons the hard way. And yet there was a significant number of people came to follow Christ, and we left with a congregation of about 170 there, and with adults and children. And we were very excited by that. The other time we church planted was in the 90s, which was the next decade, and we planted in New Farm for the Baptist Union, as it was called then, and we planted in New Farm. And I reflect on this with some pain, really, because in the midst of this, my parents died, and I learned some valuable lessons about the kind of things that church planters have to face. And I think, facing all those with the grief as well really found me out, and I had to leave it to my associate and one of the team and kind of try and recover myself. So I've had two significant commitments to church planting myself and loved it and felt called into it. And after that, I think I've just been reading and researching and trying to help others. I learned a few valuable lessons, and I just want to support others as they attempt this very important work. We need hundreds and hundreds of new churches if we're going to have any traction in kind of addressing culture. We're going to need hundreds of them, and we're going to need them all to love Jesus, love his mission, love discipleship. Boy, we got a job in front of us, but I'm really pumped for it. I think it's stuff of legend. Let's get on with it.
That's great. Hey, Colin, I'm intrigued by one of the comments that you made going back to Canberra about the best practice rules that you broke. Would you be able to think of one or two of those rules that you broke and tell us how that worked out?
Well, first of all, it's highly advisable to assess and train planters, at least in terms of what we know as best practice now. I was neither trained for church planting nor assessed for it. I was just asked if I'd do the job. Another one was that I had no coaching, no support. I had not read into it at all. I was going in blind. And then to top it all off, I didn't have a team. The team coalesced later over a period of time. And I think at the end we had a really good team. But there was a few things that made the start particularly very difficult. As a matter of fact, all the research now that I've done shows that in the early 80s, church planters could usually get away with church planting by simply starting a meeting and inviting people to it, because that still worked. But, I never did enough homework on the context to really be able to espouse the gospel in a manner which would make sense to them. I found that out by hard knocks, So all the best practice stuff, that I've mentioned just there, we didn't do any of that. We had to learn that the hard way. But I just say this too, that even if you do make mistakes in that area, I think God's so faithful and so good. He just faithfully teaches us and unlocks things for us. So we are in good hands with him.
Your journey there sounds very similar to mine, planting in the mid-90s and planting without a proper team, without assessing, without proper coaching. But I did read a lot about church planting, but so we spent a fair bit of time in prayer and preparation. But when I look back now, it certainly doesn't tick the boxes of being best practices to give a reasonable chance of survival. Colin, how do you see the future of the church in Australia?
Look, I'm upbeat, very upbeat about it. My take on the present cultural situation, the status of the church within the nation, I think we're reaching a point which will be the floor in the census from which we'll be able to push forward. And what I'm seeing now is that the number of Christian leaders and people, Christian people, they are now more convinced than ever, I believe, that it comes down to discipleship. It comes down to discipling people properly to, bring them into the fullness of what God wants for them, and in particular, discipling them to multiplication. There's more conversation now than ever in my ministry lifetime on that. That's got to be good news. Another piece of good news is that everybody is recognizing that a wholesome engagement with community is now one of the best things we can do. And in particular, we need to counter the narrative about the church. And the best way is don't argue with them. Just love Australians. Just get out there and love Australians. And I see more and more of this now. So I actually think the future of the church is excellent, is really good. We're starting to talk about the right things. We're starting to be motivated about the right things. We're starting to realise that prayer is important, discipleship is important. We're starting to get into a pattern which is engaging, it's contextualising, it's discipleship, and it's all moving towards what we want to do, I believe, in multiplication, because the goal of discipleship has been, in my lifetime, learning.
Yes.
And coming into community. But the goal of discipleship now, I think, is multiplication. And
yes,
where I just think once we get the hang of that, we'll be flying. I'm so excited about it. I'll be sitting on the sideline cheering, holding numbers up. That's a 10. I love it. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, look, I share your view, Colin, and I think that for a long time, we haven't really taken Jesus' new commandment in John 13, 34 and 35 seriously. It's almost been something that we slip over. But when we actually see that, he says, by this, all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Right. I think there's something really in it. And as churches, we should be, more than anyone else in society, taking the love of Christ to people, not just the sense of the rights and wrongs, which some parts of the church have been known for over the years. So, Colin, what trends in Australia will impact church planting? What are the trends that you see that are on the horizon or even coming in now?
Yeah, sure. I see 2 or 3 probably. I mentioned before that every church planter now has to be reasonably good at contextualisation. And the reason for this is that Australia is both post-Christian and pre-Christian. And to contextualise the gospel is now a must. You can't ignore that. You can't just follow what we've always done. You have to do the contextualisation. And so that trend is actually creating a movement of missiology amongst the body of Christ. We're sensing again that this is our call. We love our country. We have the advantage of being able to speak their language, English. Well, in the main, it's English. And we're now recognising that there are shifts and trends in culture, and we're beginning to bring the gospel into those trends. So that's one thing that I see coming up. I think another one of the trends which is really helpful is the development in the last 4 or 5 years of third-party groupings that are coming alongside the denominations with open hands. They're not trying to take away the church planting and do it themselves, and they're not trying to tell the denominations what to do. They're coming with open hands. I think that is excellent. And look, Exponential is a brilliant example of that, coming alongside to support. It's a beautiful thing. And then you've got other groups like New Thing and City to City and Geneva Push and Acts 29. These are excellent developments, and especially in the last few years they've come across. But now you've got people wanting to put, wealthy people wanting to invest in new things. This is a great time to be a planter, I tell you. We should theoretically have thousands of people lining up, because it's kind of, well, I know it's an extreme sport really, but still, these are all very good trends. The other trend is that we're no longer thinking of trying to preserve our brand. We're genuinely trying to bring the kingdom. I think that's great news. I mean, in my lifetime, as I'm sure you'd probably say, we denominations kind of squeezed the gospel down into a combination of their brand and, get your sins forgiven and go to heaven.
Yes.
But what is happening in recent years is that it's opening up again. It's a gospel of kingdom, so it's about the whole of life. And it's engaging. We're engaging with Australians, and now I think Australians will have something to look at and go, I actually like that, because we've broadened it out. That's another good trend among us.
So if I can just ask you another question along those lines, would you say that doctrinal and style differences are losing their importance in terms of the churches wanting to be very contextualized wherever they are?
I think so. I think there are distinctives in our denominations which will remain, and they will be, and people will gravitate to certain distinctions. But I think the denominations are no longer leading with their distinctions in doctrine.
Yes.
They're leading with the kingdom. And that's good news for us. I mean, it's not everywhere. It hasn't reached to the very edges, but I think it's a trend which is really good news for us, because we're allowing the gospel. I mean, like you take the word peace. I mean, a lot of Australian Christians have just understood peace to be the absence of struggle and war. But we both know, don't we, that when the shalom comes, there's so much in it. It's broad, it's a wide flowing river full of grace, full of hope. And so I think that kind of trend will actually mean that denominations may not lose their distinctiveness, but they will actually not be leading with them, and they won't be leading with their brand. They'll be leading with the kingdom, and that's going to be good for us.
That's good. Colin, I remember when we met some time ago, you said that the number one reason for going to an established church, it is now community, whereas some years ago it was preaching. Would you care to comment on that and just unpack that a little bit for us? I think that's important.
God asked me and provoked me to start a PhD back in October 15. And so I began to work with Baptist pastors in the period of time from 1986 to 2015. And I began to ask the church planters, well, one of the questions I asked them was, what was the number one thing you did to grow your church? Now, all the guys early from the 86 to the late 90s, they all said, number one, preaching. But all the guys from that point to the end of the period all said building authentic community and integrating into the community and incarnating the gospel into the community was the numbers 1 and 2, and number 3 was preaching. And I thought that was that's an interesting development. It doesn't mean, and we shouldn't interpret it to mean, that preaching isn't important. It means that the nature of the gospel now is, as Creda would say, is a patient ferment. It's a ferment of relationships. It's a ferment of interactions. And then the gospel is integrated into that so that you get this beautiful symmetry. So it was one of the interesting things I found in my PhD, that really we've shifted a lot. Nobody was saying, oh, don't preach as much now, it doesn't work. It was just that people were sensing there were important things going on.
So, Colin, do you think that's a reflection of the fact that we've been going gradually, well, not even gradually, but we've been continuing on that spectrum towards a post-Christian culture? And therefore, preaching to the converted isn't the tool that's going to work.
Yeah, I think there is something in that, Tim. The post-Christian stuff, being living in a culture that's post-Christian, of course, raises all the moral questions. But being pre-Christian at the same time means that many of our fellow Australians are quite blind on why Jesus came, who he is, why he has come. There's no RE, or there's little RE. Perhaps that's unfair. There's a lot of good RE going on, but the number of Australians who've been in RE is lowering. The number of Australians who've been to Sunday school is lowering very quickly. The number of people who have Christian parents and grandparents is lowering. So what we're seeing is that there are significant challenges to us, and so we can't just stand on a street corner. That doesn't work now. But what does work is a genuine life-on-life thing where we live the gospel and bring it with us as we live it. And essentially, I think we are where second century Christians were all those centuries ago in recognizing that they didn't have the power or the influence to do all the preaching, but they did have the power of a patiently fermenting life, living Christ in front of people. And as a result of that, bringing the gospel into real life to the point where people begin to say, please tell me, what is this you are doing? I think that's where we're at culturally because of the pre-Christian, post-Christian thing.
Yeah, no, that's good. You mentioned your PhD. Could you just outline some of the things that you've discovered from your research that might help inform church planting in Australia?
Yes, I'll give you a little hint, teaser, as they might say. I'm just finishing it now. What happened when I did the interviews was that the whole PhD was about the factors that determine the viability of a church in its first 5 years. What actually could make a new church able to do what Jesus had called it to do. That's what I mean by viability. If a church is able to do what Jesus has told them to do, they may only be 10 people, but they're still viable because they're able to do what Jesus has told them to do. And so what I began to find was, the symmetry between the team and the leader has to be well thought out and managed. You can't just a leader having a group of people who are gophers for him or her. It has to be much more than that. There has to be a symmetry in vision, in passion, in the essence of life, on life, all of those kinds of things. The other thing I found was that the leadership transitions for new churches in their first 5 years are critical. If you get them wrong, it can be history sometimes. So you have to watch those symmetries, those transitions. Another thing was the contextualization thing we've already talked about. Another thing was the way we support. A number of church planters said that the support agency or the support groups behind them were nervous about the risk taking, and so there's issues about the way in which support is offered and the consistency of that support as well. And some of these carry real force, so you get, if you're doing it well and you've got a guy who's leading, a person who's leading, who's got a good life balance, they've got a good team around them, you're more likely to get the right tenure. Ideally, you need in Australia a church planter that will get through the first 5 years. That's the critical first 5 years. Yeah. You can get them through there. You usually are going to have a church long term. What happens though also is that I found that there are transition periods in new churches. Like, for example, in years 3 and 4, it's not uncommon for a planter who's begun the process to actually get to a point where, with the increase of pastoral needs, they actually don't find themselves at all at home, and they actually need to leave. So you need to organise a transition for them into something else and to restart the process for them, and then bring a pastoral leader in. Sometimes you can get the guy can get you right through, right up to year 7 and 8, when the leadership issues, instead of, often in a new church, the leadership base is quite narrow. Well, by the time you get to year 7 and 8, you've got to widen it right out. Otherwise, you're never going to make it through that transition. And then, of course, the last one is the 12, 13. Around the year 12, 13, that's when you've got to revisit the culture again. So there's a whole bunch of things. I'm trying to wrestle this elephant to the ground right now to finish it by the end of the year. So I'll be amazed about, what I can actually do apart from the PhD soon.
Well, I'm going to be absolutely fascinated to look at what comes out of your PhD, and I'm sure it's going to be a huge blessing for the church in Australia. The research that you're doing on church planting. Colin, just before we finish off, I have some good news for you, and that is that March next year, March 2023, we're going to be putting on some regional conferences in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. Excellent. And we've got Ed Stetzer, Dave Ferguson, Bishop Rick Ford from the UK, and Bree Mills from Microchurch Australia, that are going to be putting on one-day conferences in those regions. So let's hope that we can all get together and see enthusiastic people and people wanting to learn coming along to these conferences and be stimulated and learn. Colin, thank you so much for your time today.
I've heard all those 4 speak, Tim. I've heard all 4 of those, and they're good choices. So everybody, get in on it.
They're fantastic choices. Okay, thanks, Colin, and blessings.
No worries. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.